Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. So if you guys tuned in to our last episode, we attempted to have a discussion on Michael Malice's definition of the red pill. This is something we kind of wanted to do for a while because, the term like red pill gets thrown around a lot. And I think Michael Malice's definition is just a fascinating way of looking at it, and it distills a lot of people's worldviews. So we attempted to have that discussion, and we were quickly bogged down on it isn't uncommon for us to get bogged down in a side issue we didn't plan on tackling. So it turns out we ended up having an episode mostly about snarkiness and very, very highly charged language and political discourse and the implications of that. And I pretty much we ended up at a point where I gave my well, that's a good way of putting this. I almost endorsed political violence. I got to that extreme, so I outed myself as a pretty wild radical there. And I think it was a good conversation because I had a lot of thoughts, especially we ended up talking about the Libertarian Party a lot and where that's going and where I would like to see it go. So we got a lot of stuff out there that had virtually nothing to do with the concept of the red pill. I mean, I think it is tangentially related to it because it all stemmed from Michael Malice's attitude and the tact he takes when he dismisses or debates people. But it wasn't actually related to the descriptive worldview that he's trying to describe. So we're going to revisit that and attempt to stay on topic this time and then just go into it a little bit and kind of our reactions to it and how accurate and descriptive we think it is and what the implications of it are and some related observations. So I guess I'm gonna read back the definition because I don't assume people would remember it. So, and this is Michael Malice. This is a direct quote. It is, red pilling is the concept that what is presented as truth by the corporate press is, in fact, a carefully constructed narrative designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. So it's this big picture idea that and I like how he used the term corporate press as opposed to like mainstream media. He's talking specifically about the institutions, the corporate press. Their whole role is to keep the status quo, keep the elite, however you want to phrase it, keep the neoliberal consensus in power. So I guess we can go from there. I'm not sure if you want to jump off some thoughts or if I'll just start going through kind of the related list I want to tackle. Okay. So
you can go through the related list. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the first things that I like about this definition of the red pill is it kind of takes the idea that the media and the news is meant to be informative and it subverts it. So even though the news does have information in it that is true, it isn't always educational or valuable or framed in a way that is actually descriptive of the world. So it's not that they're necessarily lying to your face, but it's the information they're presenting is, it's working towards this carefully constructive narrative and it's a goal that they're working towards. So the example that came up this week or in the last couple of weeks is the whole scandal over Dr. Jill Biden going by doctor. And I'm not sure if you heard about this. So essentially what happened is a person at the Wall Street Journal wrote an opinion piece that, and this was talked about for about a week on all kinds of opinion podcasts I listened to. So this was covered on The Dispatch, The Bulwark. It was covered on leftist podcasts. So things like Pod Save America touched on it. Ben Shapiro touched on it. It's like this big flashpoint for a week all over if Dr. Jill Biden should go by doctor, and she has an EED degree, which is a degree that is it's essentially similar to a PhD, but in a specific field of education. And if you weren't familiar, Jill Biden's handle on Twitter is @DrJillBiden. And I know on The View at one point last year, one of the hosts suggested that Dr. Jill Biden should be the next I screwed that one up. They should be the next Surgeon General of the United States because they confuse doctor with, like a real doctor. So you get this snarky Wall Street Journal opinionist. It's a piece where it's saying like, hey kid, you probably shouldn't call yourself doctor because people are going to think you're a real doctor. And if you're on a plane and somebody said, are you a doctor? If you said yes, everybody'd be like, no, you're not. You don't know anything about medicine. You just have a graduate degree in education. So a lot of people on the right wing are like, ha, 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 yes, this is true. I don't want a gender studies PhD to stand up on a plane and say they can help me because they're a doctor when they can't help me. And of course, this conversation has absolutely no value. And it is clear to everybody that this is the most unimportant conversation you could possibly be having. And that this is what is in like mainstream commentary for an entire week, because it came out not this past Saturday, but the Saturday before that. And then it was on I was hearing about it through Thursday or Friday. So it was in the news coverage for about 5 or 6 days. It's like, oh, this just shows Americans are sexist. They don't want to call her a doctor because it's a lot of women get education degrees. Now we don't care. It's used to make all these arguments that aren't valuable, and it's all based on a stupid opinion piece that's kind of a joke. So this is what I mean, right? So there's something that's not important, and it gets turned into a cultural flashpoint. It could have easily been ignored, like most Wall Street Journal opinion pieces are. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people read everything that comes out that way, but most aren't talked about for 5 days straight on a ton of news programs. But this one, it's like, oh, we can take a right-wing people, our misogynist angle, because they're discrediting the next first lady. So all the left-wing pundits say, oh, of course they want to attack the first lady. And then it's going back and forth on random things like this, and it's ad hominem attacks that essentially have no educational value, and it's just filling up news time and filling up people's heads. So I guess the reason why I detail all this is because to me, when this whole thing unfolded in front of me, it's like, this is why I think that the news media, or this is why I'm red pilled on the news media. I think they care about a narrative. They'll do things to push a narrative, and they don't care about actually informing me on things that matter. They're presenting me a story, and then they're arguing about a story that is at most meant to divide people on pretty artificial points about an issue that really doesn't matter or affect anybody. So you can't really make a good argument that that story is like valuable information that the news should be covering. Yet it's in the news, and it's all the news is talking about because it's a self-reinforcing cycle. And that's why we're covering it, because part of the self-reinforcing cycle to some extent, because you have to comment on what people are talking about, so then they stir up all the drama around it, and then now they're talking about that. And why are they talking about it? Because everybody's talking about it. But it's all pointless, and it's also, you can make cultural flashpoints an issue. So that, I think, is an example of what Michael Malice is kind of describing, right? They have a narrative, they have an agenda, and they're pushing it by pushing a lot of stories that don't matter. And I lovingly refer to these as fake news. To much to your chagrin, and we can get into how I throw that term around sometimes. But this is kind of what I mean: stories that don't matter, and they hog the news cycle. So that's my long cold open, and you can jump in.
So I might say a few things that I said in our last attempt, but I'll try to cover mostly new ground. I think by, at least from the definition that I'm hearing you talk about in terms of the media, I think you could say I'm also red-pilled on the media. I don't look at it. There's no news source that I look at that I don't think has some sort of narrative that they're trying to convince me of. They don't have some kind of agenda or ideology or that there's some reason for that, particular newspaper or website or podcast or TV show or YouTube channel to exist. Well, we're talking about corporate media, so not YouTube necessarily, unless it's YouTube channels connected with corporate media. So I completely agree with that. I guess maybe one place I would want to explore is how we distinguish, if we're able to distinguish between different news outlets, and how we distinguish between different news outlets, because I don't think all news outlets are equally biased. And I don't think, and this would kind of get into my issue with the term fake news, but and I don't know how Michael Malice would respond to this, But if you compare Breitbart to the New York Times, for example, and imagine you have to label one of them as fake news. Again, I think the term isn't helpful, but if I have to label one of them as fake news, I'm going to label Breitbart as fake news because it's not comparable to the New York Times. I have issues with the New York Times, and I could go on and on for hours about my issues with the New York Times, but I don't think all news outlets are created equal. And so certain outlets, even certain corporate outlets or mainstream outlets, I'm willing to say that they're news, or that a lot of what they say is legitimate, even if they have a narrative they're pushing, and even if the New York Times is more than happy to go along with the neoliberal consensus. So I disagree with the New York Times' overall narrative. But that doesn't mean I don't trust the New York Times to tell me certain things about certain events happening. I trust, and I think I mentioned this before, either on a previous podcast or in the last attempt. There's a difference between like the opinions that say the New York Times puts forward, like in their opinion section, and then the facts they're reporting on the ground. And I can trust the facts they're reporting on the ground without trusting their opinions. And I can trust that the New York Times has a higher standard of reporting than Breitbart does, or that their integrity is they have more integrity. The New York Times has more integrity than Breitbart does, or they are more news than Breitbart is. They are less fake news than Breitbart is, or they are less likely to perpetuate fake news. So it really depends. I think when we're talking about corporate media, I do think we need at some level to try to distinguish between different outlets, and we need to. I would just want to engage with Michael Malice or his. I wouldn't want to engage with his argument more about how people are able to distinguish different outlets, even though all outlets, especially corporate outlets, have a narrative they're pushing.
So he uses the phrase factually, so it can be factual, but not truthful. So I think the way of conceptualizing this is, it's kind of like what you're explaining. So if you read a given article in the New York Times, it is likely that one article is better sourced and is more likely to be factual than an article on Breitbart. And I would agree with that. But the issue is the New York Times has so much on in the background about what they cover and how they go about covering it, that even if they get the facts right, they take an angle on everything. So as a whole, you can't actually. So it's like you take the integrity and the legitimacy that the one article alone is, everything it tells you is literally true, but it might not necessarily be truthful as a big picture if you read the New York Times. So as you're flipping through, you'll notice that they cover stories predominantly that either lean in a certain way, or the angle that they take on them, while they only tell you facts, they can take something at a certain angle. And if you go on Twitter, and I know you don't like Twitter that much, which is perfectly fine, and you probably shouldn't like Twitter. It's mostly a partisan bloodbath that has no value. But one of the things that you'll see all the time from right wingers is there'll be a story that is like very, very obvious, right? So like it's something that you can watch happen on TV. So like imagine you watch Trump's last press conference when he came out and he said something about the stimulus and how he doesn't like that it was only $600 per person, and he said it should be $2,000. Well, you can watch the video, and then when you see the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal recap a video that you watched, you'll notice that they don't present it the same way when they put it into words. So everything they'll say will be factually true. They'll tell you exactly what he said, but some people, Are you familiar with the meme that's like that something will happen and it will say Republicans pounce? Is that something you've seen? Okay, so a thing that you'll see a lot from right wingers on Twitter is something will happen where like a Democratic a person who's of the left will essentially say something in bad taste, or they'll say something that's like a flub, or they'll, you know, it's like a gaffe will happen. And the story in a lot of outlets won't be that somebody made a gaffe. It'll be all these Republicans are saying this about this person. So you'll look at the article and you'll see like, oh, it's about how Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz said this thing targeting this Democratic official. But the story to all the right wingers is, look what the Democratic official said. Why aren't you reporting what they said? No, you're reporting that the Republicans pounced on what they said, right? So it's technically true. It's like, yeah, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio did respond in this like dramatic way to the gaffe, but the story should be the gaffe. So it's like either way of reporting it is true, right? So if you report on the gaffe, you're reporting truth, or you're reporting factually, and if you're reporting on the response to the gaffe, you're reporting factually. But one newspaper could put the emphasis on the response to the gaffe when it suits their political priors. And this is kind of when you'll see like factually true but not like honest type of reporting, or things that show directions towards an agenda or a narrative. Now, I don't think Michael Malice pretends like Breitbart and Zero Hedge and all these other sites don't have a bias. I just think it's more present in the corporate media because the corporate media is generally backing the establishment. So what they're doing is to keep people in charge and to keep the status quo alive, or at least point it in the direction they want. So that's why he focuses on them. If you talked about Zero Hedge or something, or InfoWars, it's like, well, sure, they're directionally biased, but, you know, it's like they aren't holding the levers of power at all times. So I think it's not necessarily that he would discount that they're not doing it. He knows they're pushing an agenda. It's just more malicious with the corporate press because that's what the default setting is for, you know, the average person that's mostly doesn't care about news is, oh, the New York Times said this. Okay. And it's not like thinking about it like, oh, well, did they cover the pounce or did they recover the gaffe?
I guess I'm still a little confused as to if we're agreeing or if we're disagreeing. Because as I said, or as I already acknowledged, the corporate media definitely has a narrative, and I don't trust the corporate media at the level of their narrative. But I think it's more, I mean, I don't have to harp on the New York Times specifically, but it's more than just, oh, I read one truth or article about the New York Times, therefore I trust the New York Times. It's more than that. Because, I mean, maybe another example would be Fox News versus, let's say NBC News. Fox News, now, of course, with Trump losing election, perhaps Fox News will crash because Trump will create a Trump TV station. Who knows? Fox News might be on its last legs. But anyway, Fox News it is politically, at some level, it is an activist organization. NBC News is not an activist organization. Now, both of them are wings of the corporate press. Both of them are putting forward aspects of the neoliberal consensus, just variations on the neoliberal consensus. But one of them is far more influential on the ground, or one of them is far more influential in getting people to do things than the other one is. And because at some level, Fox News or hosts on Fox News, they talk in such a way to encourage people to go out and at some level shake up the system or spit in the eyes of the Democratic establishment or whatever. There's a difference between Lester Holt and Sean Hannity. There's a difference between Lester Holt and even Chris Wallace. Chris Wallace, the supposed just guy reporting the news on Fox News, would be a more comparable person to Lester Holt, since Sean Hannity is technically an opinion journalist. But NBC News is not really. If I watch Fox News and versus I watch NBC News, one is really has more of, or it has Fox News has an agenda which is far more politically, what's the word? It is far more politically potent than NBC nightly news. Because when if I watch Lester Holt, the 30-minute or less than 30-minute NBC nightly news, Lester Holt reading a teleprompter, sure, I'm getting the narrative, I'm getting the neoliberal consensus narrative, but it's less. I find it less worrisome because of the way that they're presenting it, and I find it less malicious for that very reason. Again, all I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to defend the corporate media, but I am trying to say I think there are distinctions to be made within the corporate media, and there are wings of the corporate media that I trust more or less than others, just like there are wings of the alternative media that I trust more or less.
So I think I get where we're not on the same page, but I was agreeing with you before, and I was just kind of spelling out nuance. So we're mostly in agreement, and I don't actively disagree with what you're saying in terms of like the descriptive nature of like, obviously Fox News is more overtly biased and politically charged, and they're actively, overtly, into everybody's eyes watching it, they're an activist organization, or at least they were more so. They might be being less, who knows. But we'd agree like One America News and Newsmax, we'd agree those are activist networks. Now, I think this is why Michael Malice would say the other ones like Lester Holt are actually more malicious, because they're the ones who are the gatekeepers. So the issue he's saying is the corporate press sets themselves as the role of the gatekeepers of what is the allowable opinion. And then once they decide what they're the gatekeepers of and what is acceptable to do and what gets covered on the news and what is newsworthy, and like, oh, well, you can get the news straight from him and all he's doing is telling you the news straight, that's where it gets really insidious. Because then it's like, oh, obviously stimulus is a good thing. Like there are all these things baked into the cake of even like local news. Like, oh yeah, go out and vote. It's voting day. Voting day is good. You know, you have people who casually say things that like imply all sorts of political stances that aren't seen as controversial because they're more innocuous and they aren't as overtly charged. And that's where it becomes so malevolent, is because these are the small things that tell you what is okay to do, and it tells you not to revolt, and it tells you like, this is what's allowed. This is what decency is in our political system, and you can't stray from it, because the people who are the respectable people on TV, not the Fox News people, but the respectable people in the corporate press, they're all professional in this way. So even though they're not saying things like you should believe X, Y, and Z, it's like they'll cover a story in a way that is normal to us, but that's because the normal way is the status quo that props up the elites. And that's why for like decades, you'll have candidates run on essentially the same foreign policy, because anything outside of that small, section would be like otherworldly. But it's like, but people like Lester Holt have taught us that these things are normal and normal to be expected, and normal isn't something we should change, right? That's the respectable thing, is to keep it in that order. So I think you would say the facade of no bias, even if it might not be that biased, it's propping up the basis that we use for our political organization in the United States. And that's what's malicious, because that keeps the establishment in charge indefinitely. No matter who ends up winning the races, most of the people are the same on like, the warfare welfare state. So he'd probably say like, yeah, but bias is bad if people think it's not biased. But that's a separate issue completely. The issue is the gatekeepers that are respectable, who everybody thinks is respectable. So now people aren't, everybody just has it built in them that it's wrong to act in certain ways. And us thinking that is what keeps unpleasant people in charge.
I mean, I guess then so maybe we disagree on which kind of media is more evil, so to speak, because I would never claim that NBC, like I said, every news outlet ever in the history of humanity, or let alone every news outlet that exists right now in 2020, is biased.
This
So
isn't a conversation about bias, though. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about bias. That's the thing. He's addressing the idea of gatekeepers. And then that if you have our system and the respected people are the gatekeepers and they're keeping up the status quo, then that's a problem. So it doesn't matter if they're biased or Fox News is more biased. It's not a competition. That's not what he's evaluating. He's just saying, here's the corporate press. They're telling you what is trustworthy and what isn't, and they're telling you who the experts are, and they're telling you what the experts think, and then you follow along. And the people that we know are in charge right now, the Democrats and the Republicans, we know they're bad people. We know that they perpetuate the warfare welfare state. These people aren't good, and they're seen as respectable senators. I know everybody has low approval ratings of, like, say, the Senate when they're asked, but whenever there's a political official that's high ranking, in their neighborhood, people usually are like, oh, that person showed up. That's an interesting thing. Before Trump, people used to like give deference to the presidential office, even if they didn't like him. So it's one of those things where it's just like, it's not about if they're biased. That's a separate thing. That's not what he's tackling. He's just saying these are the gatekeepers that seem innocuous, are perpetuating the system, and they're the people who are helping hold up these people in power that are doing things that we know are evil. That's what he's calling out, right? So it's not about if Fox News is worse or better. It's about the problem of those gatekeepers. So that's why I don't know if you are on like I don't know if Michael Malice would call you red pilled, because even if you know a lot of news is propaganda, I don't know if you're kind of putting the piece that he put in. He's slotting two pieces together that I don't know if you agree with, which is the generic world that we live in is predicated on certain formal ways of interacting, or the basis of the establishment is rooted in how we treat politics and what we care about in politics, and all that's based in what like people like Lester Holt say. And that makes them the real villains, because if they were willing to call out completely different things, then we'd have a completely different political order. But instead, we all defer to them as experts, and they defer to the experts, and they defer to the experts. But when we get up top, we realize, oh, wait, these are the people we hate for getting us in wars for the last 2 decades. That's not good. But when we watch Lester Holt, we just think of the people as experts talking. That's the issue.
Well, but again, I guess I'm still, I mean, I'm not sure. I still don't know where we're disagreeing then, because I agree that the NBC and ABC and CBS and NBC and the New York Times and all these outlets have, as I said, they have this meta narrative that they're pushing, and they're trying to make sure that no other, it's like a natural selection, so to speak, except it's an artificial selection in the sense that all these different meta narratives are possible out there, and the corporate media and the government and all these different, and I guess Michael Malice would say academia, all these institutions are making sure that this meta narrative goes unchallenged. I don't disagree with that. So yeah.
Okay, so I guess the reason I was pushing back is because you keep bringing up Fox News, and I understand that Fox News is biased. I just don't think that has anything to do with why NBC is such a threat. So we might completely agree, and it's just like I just don't see how I think Fox News is an unrelated conversation, right? Because I think they're two different kinds, and I don't think it's just not the same realm, I guess. Because the real issue is the straight shooters that say they're straight shooters, but in reality, it's like they're like very typical NPR thinkers that are telling you what to think on NPR. Those are the ones that he has the issue with, and I have the issue with as well.
I mean, my issue with the corporate media, I mean, we did an episode on media where we watched a Rachel Maddow interviewed Jon Stewart, and Jon Stewart's done quite a few interviews about the corporate media, and Jon Stewart would say, corporate media is built on sensationalism, conflict, laziness. That really, I guess, would be my major critique, along with aspects of Malice's critique, or most of Malice's critique. But you can't have, if you have a 30-minute show or even an hour-long show, you can't have the necessary in-depth conversations that you need on the issues that affect all of us. And so there's a certain format you have to follow, because you have a commercial you have to get to. So, all right, person A, spout the Republican talking points. Person B, spout the Democratic talking points. All right, commercial. We'll come back again in 3 minutes and you'll do it again. I think I'm thinking about this out loud. I mean, I think I agree at one level, but I think I also do disagree at another level. I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly where the distinctions lie. Maybe it goes back almost to the previous conversation. I don't necessarily think.
So I think to lean more into where we could find some more friction in the conversation is the intent that it's a carefully constructive narrative designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. So I think Michael Malice would argue that a lot of the ways the news is given to us in the form of talking points is by design. And it's not just because, this is the design of how we fit into commercials and that's the reason why they don't do long form talk. I think a lot of it is this is the most effective. I guess I don't really like the phrase opiate of the masses because I think it's a little cliche, but it's like the most effective way to get the line across to people who only dedicate so much brain space to news. And if your goal is to inculcate the basic information you find important to your agenda, then it's much easier to do that through a host talking at the screen and interviewing one person than it is to try to do 3-hour lecture series. If there was intent on, people actually learning things, we would have a lot more stuff out there that is long form discussions. And we do have a lot of stuff like that. And a lot of stuff like that ends up being profitable just through other business models. And it could be profitable in a television model. But I guess I think I would wager, though, that it's done the way it is because it works for what they want to do. They want to get their talking points out there, and the goal is an education. And like TV revenues from ads are much more flexible than they were then. So it's not just that they're legacy and can't adapt, because they've tried a lot of new things over time. It seems like they do the recurring emphasis on one host telling you talking points and hoping you trust that host. And if you don't trust that host, you watch the other one with the host you do trust. And I think it's because it's effective for what they want. And to some extent, it's like I don't blame them, because back when I was a neocon, it's like I listened to Ben Shapiro. And I thought he generally had good takes. And then he told me his agenda and he told me his interpretation. And then I was like, I know his talking points. Good. That's good. To give that pundit the benefit of the doubt, he'd at least try to give you the leftist talking point and the counter argument. But it's like, if you're going to just tell people surface level information that's not that important and you want to inculcate them with it, then that's the way to do it. And I don't necessarily want to believe that's a happy coincidence, right? And I think this also ties into education, because if our education was all about educating people how to actually know things, then I think there are much better ways to do it, and I think they would do them. But I don't think that's the goal.
So in what way, then, am I not red-pilled in this sense? Would you say, or what would be your guess as to why Michael Malice would say I'm not red-pilled? That might get us somewhere. I'm having trouble conceptualizing this conversation. So
what I just explained is about intention, right? So I'm reemphasizing how it's a carefully constructed narrative, and how maybe the way they're delivering news is with that purpose of constructing the narrative. So even though things they're saying is true, they deliver it in this fashion because it's narrative. So I think the point that you might be getting at, which is kind of like the Jon Stewart line, is that they're doing it because of the profit motive. and that they aren't doing it because they're trying to hold certain people in power. They're doing it because that's just the way cable news is. That's how you get ratings. And to some extent, it's like, well, yeah, sure, that's how it gets ratings because that's how it distracts people. And the way you distract people and also don't inform them and also politically engage people is by talking about Dr. Jill Biden's title, Doctor, because a bunch of people get all heated about sexism and then it's commentary, but it's not, doesn't really have any value and they sensationalize it, but it could get ratings. But it's also like you're dividing people because you want people to be divided on R&D lines all the time. So you can argue it's for profit, but I would argue, well, they have an agenda, they're actively pushing it, and it's because they're malicious. And it's because they know when they heighten a story, it's because they want this results. And when they do it in formats like having Rachel Maddow only bring on people who agree with her to then talk about how much they agree, or the people they bring on to argue with Rachel Maddow are only the most inflammatory right-wing people. It's never really reasonable right-wing people. It's like, yeah, it's not just because of the format. It's because you guys want it to be inflammatory, but it's not just because you're sensationalizing it for profit. It's because you're sensationalizing it for the agenda, because you guys want people to have this reaction because you're trying to keep people in power and keep people distracted, or you're trying to keep people on party lines, or you're trying to keep people, doing what you want them to do. So it's more malicious.
Would this be a good place to talk a little bit about the term fake news, or should we go into, I think another part of the conversation we want to touch on before we wrap up is education, or academia at least, because that is definitely something I think I would disagree with you and Michael Malice on. So I'll let you decide which one I can.
Well, I think we already covered the fake news spot a lot. There is like a meta question that arises from, I guess, accepting the worldview we've been talking about that I kind of wanted to touch on. But maybe we can talk about the academic institutions first and see where that goes. And I kind of want to hear what your thoughts on that, because I don't think mine are as, well, what's the word for it? Heavily, I guess, partisan, or I don't think they're necessarily intensely principled, because I just don't have intense feelings about this issue.
Are you there? Well, and well, I guess what I hear a lot, and Michael Malice is not like a traditional neocon, but like you hear a lot of criticism of academia from neocons, and I often roll my eyes at those arguments because I just don't find them at all convincing. So I guess what I would need to, or what we should talk about more here then, is how or where the role of academia is in this narrative that is being pushed by these unpleasant people. Because I actually think
I have a question. I need clarification. Can I hear what you perceive as the neocon argument about colleges before you kind of explain how you see it differently? Because you dismissed it, and I think I'm sympathetic to some points they make and not to others, so I don't know what you're dismissing.
Basically, what I'm dismissing is this idea that colleges have a liberal bias, or universities, the academia has a liberal bias. That's really what I'm dismissing. And I'm dismissing it because I just don't see that liberal bias that they're talking about. I mean, I dismiss liberal bias in the media as well, in a sense, but that we've already talked about that. The academia, and that's why I was about to say I need to, I guess, further understand how, where Michael Malice, his view on academia's role in this construction of this particular narrative, because I just don't think academia is a weird institution. It's almost a bubble, honestly. Professors, they live in a little bubble. And that's not necessarily a criticism or a compliment. It just is what it is. There are these people. They get master's degrees or PhDs depending on the field, and they're talking about they teach classes on a particular subject: history, physics, accounting, whatever. maybe if they're like, they might have research students, they might have graduate students if they supervise other PhDs, or they might just purely teach, or they might do their own research, or it's a combination. But I guess what I disagree on is the idea that the academia is maliciously putting forward a narrative that is harmful to society at large. Academia is, and this is not even talking about like K through 12 education, which is slightly different. But you know, if you go to most colleges, that all they're concerned with is this idea. I mean, okay, let me put it like this: the idea that you need to go to college, that's part of the overall narrative. Okay, so in this technological age, all right, you got to get a 4-year degree, a bachelor's degree. Maybe you need to get a master's degree. But the idea, okay, so you got to go to college, you got to take this, this, and this. That's part of the narrative. But I don't think I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't think the curriculum itself. I don't think that this narrative is infects the curriculum. I think the curriculum is pretty solid that across different colleges and universities. And I say it's a bubble because I don't even think colleges and universities are necessarily as influential as some people think they are. But I just don't think if you take certain classes that there's necessarily this liberal or neoliberal bias that is infecting everything you study, and it's just, therefore it's poison. If you get a degree in chemistry, you're getting a degree in you're getting a degree in chemistry. Now, in terms of like certain social sciences and humanities, it gets a bit trickier. You know, if you might, in the political science department, you might find a Marxist professor. That's probably going to happen. Most professors do tend to be liberal or left-leaning. That's true. But that doesn't mean their liberal or left-leaning politics poisons what they're the information that they're giving you. I think colleges and universities, I guess I don't think they're malicious, and I don't think they're actually harming people or harming society at large. There are definitely criticisms of colleges and universities and of the structure and of the curriculum, and we can get into that. But overall, I will defend academia as an institution, generally speaking.
Okay, so I think that clarifies a lot of where we are separate on a lot of these things, because I do see very clearly as you're talking about that how I see them all falling under the same umbrella and kind of being the same issue. So it's kind of like how if I throw on NPR now as a person who has niche political tastes and consumes a lot of news, and I like to think that I take in news from a lot of angles so I can tell the way they're slanted. When I hear NPR, the slant that NPR decides to take on story to story or what they cover out of the day, considering they'll do like a 15-minute program, and I've heard like an hour and a half's worth of news, but covered in 10 different ways. Seeing what they choose to cover for 15 minutes is also noteworthy. But if a normal person who gets like a random college degree, like in finance or something, that is innocuous, they probably will just hear it for what it is. So I think this goes back to, it's similar to the Lester Holt phenomenon. So it's kind of one of those situations where, like, yeah, the most, when I look back at it, the most overtly biased in the opposite way of Fox News is bias. The most overt in my whole college career was my gen ed humanity classes. There were classes that now, reflecting on them, knowing what I know now, I'm like, oh my God, that was the stuff that would freak Ben Shapiro out because that was pure wokeism stuff. And I was just sitting there like, what are they talking about? Who cares? But I wasn't offended by it because it wasn't really a flashpoint. But like, I was like a year or two behind the cultural. I was like a year or two ahead of the cultural curve. So I just didn't care. I was just like, this is kind of stupid, but whatever. But looking back, I'm like, oh my God, that was like the stuff that only, far left culturally people care about. Nobody else talks about it. The only people I ever hear talk about it would be considered, I mean, yeah. So, okay. So that's part of what you're saying, right? You're like, okay, yeah, I know that there's degrees that are really dumb sometimes in some schools, and there are some teachers you'll have that are super far left overtly. But that's the minority. Then you have things like chemistry. But the thing is, when I listen to right-wing pundits, the right-wing pundits glorify the technical degrees that aren't humanities. So they glorify a lot of the science degrees, and the only time the science degrees make the news when the neocons are hating on higher education is when it's like, oh, look, this one science textbook did something that seems to cave to wokeism. We're going to cover it for a day because it's a culture war story. And those don't really matter either, and I hate when they cover those stories, and who cares? The issue is it's just like how I think K through 12 school is kind of to make you an obedient worker. So you go to school, you learn a lot of things, but you don't necessarily learn how to think that well, but you know how to follow procedures. So I think colleges, especially now, it's since a lot of people need a degree now to do really anything, a lot of it is a continuation of learning to be obedient. But also, you're taught by these people who are allegedly experts in their field. So you take an econ class and the person has a PhD and they've been teaching for 30 years. That means you kind of are inculcated with trusting academics and trusting experts because they study the field. The issue is, especially if you've studied something like economics, you find that there are dozens and dozens of people who study the same field for 30 years. They all get Nobel Prizes and they all don't agree on a single issue. So you pretty much learn in college that you're taught by these experts in random things, and that there are these people who spend a lot of time in school and they know a lot, and you learn to defer to these experts on things you don't know a lot about. But then, once you get in the real world, you aren't often reminded these experts don't usually have any kind of consensus on really any issue, and they pick and choose the experts. So what a lot of academia is it's just it's just teaching you to trust experts and to kneel to authority, because look, here are people who study the field. They're the experts. If you're not going to get a PhD, you're not going to become one. You're going to learn a little bit and you're going to go work, but then you always know to trust the institution, trust the experts in the institution. But they don't mention that like experts disagree on every issue, right? Like food science is like the most controversial field, and every expert disagrees with each other, and they all think different things aren't healthy, and then everybody dismisses each other based on different studies, and it's all picking and choosing. So I think the issue with academia, a lot of it is a lot of what they're doing is up in the air. A lot of it is co-opted for political messaging, because then anybody on any part of the spectrum, from as far left to as far right as you can think of, can cite an academic who has something that backs what they have to say. So it's like you learn to trust experts, but anybody can co-opt experts because experts fall on different sides of every issue. And it just teaches you to be allegiant, right? And that's the issue with Lester Holt. So that's what I would say.
This is definitely a place where I think Michael Malice and I, and Michael Malice and you, or you and I would disagree. I fail to understand, or maybe I'm not in a place in life where I'm able to understand or able to empathize with the people, or with the argument that is always slamming so-called experts. Because again, I think it depends who the person is and what they're talking about. If I go to the doctor's office, I trust that at least if I'm going to a reputable hospital or clinic or whatever, I trust that the people I'm talking to, the people I'm interacting with, the people I'm answering, or who are asking me questions, and whom I'm asking questions back, whether it's a nurse or a actual doctor or a nurse practitioner. That's an instance where I'm going to trust the experts, because I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose myself the way a doctor can diagnose me, because I haven't gone through the necessary training in order to properly diagnose myself. I don't know enough about medicine to diagnose myself or diagnose other people. But then there are other instances where I would be slamming the experts. So, I think last episode when we were talking about morality, I mentioned how horrible of a human being Henry Kissinger is. And he's always interviewed on TV shows as this great expert on foreign policy. Terrible human being. I don't care if he's a so-called expert. If I believed in the death penalty, I would have him put up against a wall and shot. But that's an example of someone who's supposedly an expert that I would be criticizing, and be criticizing as vehemently as possible. So it really, again, it's similar to the conversation about the media, distinguishing between different outlets, even in the corporate media. I think we need to distinguish between people who are experts and who are put forth as experts. Now, one more quick thing, and then I'll let you jump in. In principle, yes, you should question everything and always try to find out things for yourself. And that's true, and I agree with that. And unfortunately, you have to, because we have limited time on this earth, you have to pick and choose what you learn and what you study and what you focus your attention on. Like, I haven't gotten to a point in my life where I focus my attention on medicine. So I have to listen to the experts when it comes to any symptoms I have. If I decide to go into medicine and I study a particular field, then I might be able to diagnose myself. If the symptoms are within the field that I've studied. But until then, I have to take my opinions with a grain of salt and trust that someone who studied medicine knows what they're talking about. And so everybody, at some level, you have to trust people who have studied things you don't know and know things that you don't, even while acknowledging that everyone's flawed, everyone's makes mistakes, and but you don't just trust people willy-nilly. People do need to earn that trust, but at some level, we do have to trust other people. So yeah.
So I think one of the ways we manage to talk past each other sometimes is because, so a lot of what you just said in the end is a very it's a very moderate, nuanced piece of advice that anybody would give to another person generally if they're like over the age of 18. It's like, trust the people who, after you kind of vet them, seem trustable. It's like, generally, if you're at the doctor's office, you can generally trust your doctor, and it makes sense for you to defer there. So use your nuance. Now, obviously, I agree. But the issue is the whole phenomenon that Michael Malice is pointing out and what I'm pointing out isn't really about what X person should do in their life and how X person should view the media. It's not about that. It's not about, oh, I should watch Fox News with a grain of salt. That's not what the question is. It's a descriptive analysis of what's going on in the world, right? So it's more of a worldview thing. So when we talk about the worldview, you have to remember that most people, unlike us, don't care that much about politics. And a lot of people, like a third of Americans, didn't vote. You have to remember that a lot of people who do vote don't watch much news. So if they went to college and they kind of listen to NPR sometimes and they don't watch a lot of news, and then they show an expert on TV that can point to their degrees in something, they'll generally they're more likely to defer to that expert than I am or you are, because they're like, well, it doesn't matter that much. I don't really care about politics. That person has a credential. I trust the institution. What he's saying might be right. And then you end up with people who write, and then all these people who are on TV write like 3 books, and then they're an expert that's written a bunch of books on the stuff. So of course, they know what they're talking about. So it's like all these people, the average not that concerned voter is more likely to not be as discriminatory or scrutinizing experts to the degree that would be optimal if they were somebody who was ever going to attempt to subvert our, heinous authoritarian rulers. But since most people don't have an incentive to do that because voting is such a marginal thing, and because people have busier things to do than worry about politics all day, it's just, you go to college, you learn to trust experts. If something's not in your field, you usually learn to defer to experts because normally you should, just like you said, normally you should. But then when people apply that to other things, like the media, then you'll read an article and it will say, we talked to this expert at this place and they told us this. And then you don't go, well, if I look up that dude's Twitter page, is he going to have a bunch of stuff that's highly partisan? And if you look up, or if I look him up, am I going to find out they used to be an Obama staffer? Like, what credentials are they citing when they talk about this? Or what else do I need to know about this person? So I guess what I'm saying is everything you said was pretty accurate on a case-by-case basis. Like, yeah, I would tell people to question experts when it makes sense. But when we're talking about the political world we live in, where most people are uninformed or low information voters, then it's like, and then they don't want to, because of confirmation bias, you don't want to scrutinize people you already agree with. And then you've went to college, you got your degree, and you just deferred to people with PhDs. And you know people with PhDs are smart because they taught you. So it's like, well, it's probably a smart dude, but that doesn't mean they're right. A lot of smart people are wrong. So I guess what I'm saying is all of this teaches you not to think. It teaches you to, when you don't care, be indifferent and follow orders. We have a populace that's pretty indifferent on a lot of things, and they get heated over the things that get turned into cultural flashpoints that usually don't matter. So that's where I see us kind of talking past each other as far as this analysis goes.
So two things. One, when the media says, or even someone in the media says, we interviewed this expert and they said this, again, it goes back to my case-by-case basis thing. Sometimes you should do that. Sometimes you shouldn't. So I can't say, oh, that's bad, the media shouldn't do that, because it depends on who we're talking about and who the so-called expert is and what the topic is. I'm not going to say the media shouldn't do that. That spins the narrative.
No, but that's not the point. The point is the average person isn't informed enough on issues to make the calls of when they should investigate it and when they shouldn't. So in general, because they don't care, they don't investigate it. And they learn to trust experts, and they generally are more likely to default to it than you or I would. And then that lets corporate institutions perpetuate themselves.
Well, that's the other point I was going to make, because I think the argument, I think you can make a good argument that K through 12 does teach you to be an obedient worker. I think college is much more nuanced. Given the range of material, the range of classes, the range of professors. So I'm not going to make the argument that colleges perpetuate that. Again, I think K through 12 schools basically do, but I think college is our university is just a different story altogether.
Well, I don't even think we hit on the fact that what I see is college kind of normalizes what smart people are supposed to think. That's what I felt like I got a lot of in college. So in a lot of my gen ed classes that were generally touching on things that were relevant, I guess, in a cultural or political way, it kind of shows like, hey, look, all the smart people you interact with degrees generally have this they generally have this set of views, and only rubes think this other thing. And it's not as overt as that. It's not like, haha, stupid people. Although like I have openly had academic, higher ed teachers say Fox News is for dumb people. And it's like I don't think it's that important of a point. I wouldn't like drag them through the mud over it. But it's like they do a lot to, even though they're supposed to be this inclusive body that's all about like diversity, they kind of do little things all throughout college for years of your life where they kind of say, we're the educated people because we're in this bubble, we're in the ivory tower, and smart people think like people in the bubble do. So if you're going to take something away from college, like if you don't go into academia, a lot of it is you get reinforced the neoliberal consensus, because people are like, because your gen ed teachers tell you like, well, you should care about voting. You should be listening to news. It's a reputable news source. And then they tell you like the Lester Holtz. And it's like, well, yeah, because they tell you that agenda. So I think they try to separate low class thought and high class thought, and then they do that in a way of tying that in. And I don't think it's necessarily intentional, professor by professor or anything, but that they reinforce that order of things. I didn't have a single college professor or was near any college professor that perpetuated anything remotely right wing. So I think that's a cultural thing that's worth noting.
So the issue with education, and to I guess some extent you can do it. You could say this is true of all education in general. Again, I think it's more focused on K through 12. But the issue is a lack of that they're not teaching you critical thinking. They're teaching you what to think, basically. Again, college does this to a lesser degree. I just don't think it's equivalent to K through 12 education in teaching you what to think. But that is my issue with education as it is now. We live the education model is basically pouring water into a pitcher, rather than pouring knowledge, and the water being knowledge and the pitcher being your mind. They're just pouring knowledge into you, rather than asking you to try to figure it out yourself, which is what they should be doing. What a professor should be doing on day one of any class, doesn't matter what it is, gender studies, archaeology, theoretical physics, doesn't matter. They should be they should be raising certain questions and asking the students, try to figure it out for yourself. What do you think? What are your arguments? What are your thoughts? How would you go about figuring out the answers to these questions? That's what they should be doing. And generally speaking, they don't. But that's a slightly different conversation. So yeah.
I think we might even disagree to some extent on that, because a long time ago we had a different episode on education, and we kind of talked about its meta role, I guess. And I'm not against colleges telling you, like, here's the knowledge on macroeconomics, and here's the knowledge on theoretical physics, and just pouring the water in the pitcher. I'm okay with that. It's just I think they it's just, if you're going to do that, they should be doing it much better. And because they're failing to do it in a much better way, it seems like it's because they're trying to create the filter. And it doesn't seem like they're necessarily overt about it, but it seems like it's happening to some extent. Or at least, a lot of times the filter is don't think, or don't be passionate about things that aren't school, because you should learn things right now as you're an 8-year-old. You're not allowed to go and explore things. You need to do schoolwork. So to some extent, those things are meta, right? It's not like you're not just learning algebra, you're also learning to do your homework and to show up and to sit quietly while the teacher talks, right? So I don't think it's just pouring water into a glass or a pitcher. But yeah, I do think we got a little bit off the Michael Malice, the red pill discussion. Do you want to do a last thought on academia? And then I think I have like one more relevant thing I just want to talk about, or maybe it'd almost be like brainstorming a little bit. But you can wrap this up, and then we'll transition and then close out the show.
Well, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying, you mentioned, 8-year-olds being forced to sit still for 6 hours or whatever. I mean, that's even a whole other topic you could talk about, because obviously 8-year-olds aren't going to sit still. And so you gotta alter education in such a way that lets children be children and doesn't make children be adults. Basically doesn't make children act like they're sitting in a cubicle all day, because children are meant to be running around and exploring and playing. So I mean, again, with the media and with education, there's plenty to criticize. There's plenty that needs to be changed about both institutions. I guess maybe the question is, what do you think people's motivations are? What do you think should be changed? I'm still struggling to figure. I feel like I'm really having a hard time with this conversation, because I'm not sure what I'm saying. I'm not sure what you're saying. But maybe with your brainstorming, it'll help me. It'll all come into place. It still hasn't come into place for me, and I don't know. That might be my fault, but I'm just being honest. I'm still very lost.
I think a lot of what's happening is the word choice that Michael Malice uses is more open about people's either unconscious motivations or people's conscious motivations that are framed differently from how, say, me or Michael Malice would perceive it. So I guess a way of trying to get across what I'm saying is a lot of people think democracy is important and that government's important. So if they're teaching something that strengthens political participation, it's an innocuous thing to them that they don't even know. It's just like an end of itself. And then that they might faintly know, I'm doing something good, right? It's or I'm doing this the way that I like to be doing this. So a lot of people who work in these organizations, like in a nonpartisan news outlet that's supposed to be straight shooting the news, they go in there and they're saying things like, well, I'm just giving you the news so you can, evaluate the scenarios correctly, so then when you go out and vote, you can make an educated choice. But then somebody else can watch everything that happens and says, well, you're giving legitimacy to both sides. That's Rachel Maddow's argument. She's like, well, now you're unfairly, if you're, giving a full picture, maybe you're now, you're giving one side credit you shouldn't be giving. Or then I can read it and say, well, you guys are arguing over a monopoly of power that I don't even think should exist. And he's granting the premise that that exists and that's fine. And then we're going to argue about who gets to be the ones in power. So I guess it seems like you're not willing to, it seems like you want something more overt and you want something that's more directly evil. And Michael Malice is willing to say, these people have these baked in notions that what they're doing is furthering things that work in this direction. If you defend democracy and you think it's important that everybody's an engaged citizen and you're a college professor and you're trying to enhance this because you just think that's the right thing to do. And you're going to do that and not realize that you're reinforcing the neoliberal world order. And despite that professor's belief, it's actually very evil. And there are a lot of evil people that, you have a lot of Jeffrey Epstein related people who are in charge, or you have people who are like Bill Kristol in charge or Henry Kissinger in charge. And all those people do terrible things. So despite thinking that you're a good person because everybody you know is also politically motivated like you and motivates everybody else to be politically, I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm talking about that hypothetical professor. But he's thinking, I live in a world where my wife also has a PhD. She's also a teacher. We both go and vote. I wish all my students were Democrats. I just want all of them to vote, though. Even if there's a couple Republicans, it's okay. It's important to be informed, right? It's important to be engaged. It's important to believe in democracy. So I'm going to have this ethos. And the institution reinforces that ethos. He's part of the institution, and it perpetuates the system that has, as far as I've been alive, and as far as probably Michael Malice has been alive, and probably as far as the last 100 years, if not thousands of years, those systems that self-perpetuate tend to keep people in charge that are bad. So even if they're not overtly in their head being evil, he would say, this is a malicious institution, and these people think they're doing good, and they're really parasites.
I think I am coming to kind of have a light bulb moment, and I'll say something, and then you can give your final little point, and then we'll see what happens from there, or then we'll wrap up the show. But I think so. I guess to try to conceptualize what we're talking about. Of course, Michael Malice he describes himself as an anarchist. I don't know if he specifies or if he's like an anarchist without adjectives, but I think there are aspects of the worldview of the educated classes, let's say, that I think are right. I might think they're right for different reasons than the educated classes think they're right. Or I might interpret them slightly differently, or take them a bit farther, or be a bit more moderate with them. But you mentioned how the colleges perpetuate the idea that government's important and democracy is important, and I was just sitting there thinking, but democracy is important, government is important. But then Michael Malice would say that's the example that's a part of the meta narrative that is keeping these evil people in power, and that's what I'm against. Well, so I'm sitting here saying there's aspects of that meta narrative he's talking about that I agree with. Mm-hmm. And I think should be perpetuated. Mm-hmm. And I guess to one more quick thing would just be what I was trying to say last time. I promise I'm not going down a rabbit hole. Just a very brief statement. What I was trying to say last time, and Michael Malice would probably agree with me, but I don't know. What I'm trying to say what I was trying to say last time was I was acknowledging the evil in all of us. And I was trying to say that you and I are evil, and Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama are evil, but it's to varying degrees and in different contexts and different situations. But I was trying to say, I'm not necessarily better than Henry Kissinger or Barack Obama. I've done less evil things because I never had their positions of power. I'm too young for that. But I was trying to acknowledge the evil among everybody, the evil everyone's responsible for, the evil that everyone's capable of. And so I was just trying to bring about I was trying to look at it I was trying to look at the whole picture and not just say there's some bad people in power, which there are, and try to say, remember, at some level, we're all bad people, and we really need to think, we really need to be careful when we're talking about questions of morality and ethics.
Well, I think that ties into what I wanted to say after the first part there. And I probably whitewashed Michael Malice a lot there by how he described him. But I think I got the, I guess, unconscious part of it. But the reason why he describes it in such a way is because your flashbulb realization would open up to Michael Malice. After you say that, Michael Malice would be like, yeah, you're right. You are one of the evil people. Because you don't, he would then agree with me, and he'd be like, yeah, because Matt, your co-host, he actually wants to legislate things that control you. He wants to legislate things that take your stuff. He wants to legislate that decide what you do and don't do with your property. And he wants to legislate what the government's allowed to make as a rule before they impound you and take you away from your family and lock you in a cage. And I would agree with them, because I think your ideology is evil and you think mine's evil for different reasons. And I'm okay with using that language, and I'm okay with talking to you about it, because we're not going to punch each other in the head. But I do think, like, the innocuous NPR listener, when they say, yes, I'm doing this thing, and then it's like, yeah, and democracy is good. It's like, well, I know you come to that for whatever reason you do, that is generally beyond the status quo reason, maybe. But the status quo person probably never even questions if democracy is a good thing. It took me a while before I even questioned that, and I'm definitely not predisposed towards that. But that's so far inculcated. And it's like, I would say it, but Michael Malice would be very up in front about saying it, but democracy is evil, and it's about people controlling other people. The whole lever of power is evil. So it's easy to take away it's easy for the red pill message that he's saying not to make sense if they're defending agendas and institutions you like. Because then it's not about them controlling an agenda that has to do with keeping evil people in power. And you're realizing, you're like, well, yeah, but I'm okay with the democratic system. I'm okay with having these experts we defend. And I'm not, and Michael Malice isn't. So that's where the difference lies. Because your reasoning is the same reasoning why those college professors would not think it's a bad thing that they're going in and telling people they should vote and be more informed. And I'd be like, oh, that's terrible. Why would you do that? You're telling them to perpetuate a system that's disgusting and has only led to crimes against humanity. So I guess that is a good way to tie it together on how we can have similar analysis that is somewhat cynical about media, yet then come to the conclusion of, therefore, it's more nefarious. But I kind of feel validated, because it's like, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, because of our ideological differences, that's the reason why Michael Malice's worldview happens. Is because some people, well, the majority of people, the overwhelmingly majority of people, don't realize those things are evil. So anything they do that defends it isn't seen as an effort to hold up a broken, destructive system. Now, I know you generally try to reject a lot of neoliberal orthodoxy when you have the chance to. But in the end, you don't want the government. Well, you'd say hypothetically, in some universe where people act a certain way, there could be no government. But I don't think you would be excited if overnight the government disappeared, like I would be. Or you wouldn't be excited overnight. You'd be more hyped if, like, there was universal health care the next day, which would be more government in a weird way. So I guess what this rant is you're right. That's why Michael Malice would say you're either evil or blue-pilled. And I guess who Michael Malice is directing a lot of his commentary towards is libertarian people and right-wing people. Because a lot of right-wing people just say talking points like Ben Shapiro, and it's like, those liberals are so stupid. And then Michael Malice is like, no, they're not. They're defending their worldview. And their worldview is evil, so we need to recognize it as evil, and then not just say, oh, they're dumb. We need to say, no, they're advocating a system that you and I both agree is evil. But you don't agree it's evil, which is why you're not on that side of Michael Malice's thinking. So I think that's how we tie the bow on it. I'll let you get the last words, and then we'll sign off. But I think that's think that's an okay summation.
Perhaps it also goes back to questions of malice or bad intentions. I don't know, because I think about the government. I mean, like, obviously there are plenty of politicians, probably most of them, which have pretty bad intentions. But then I look at things like issues in media and the issues in academia, and perhaps I see less bad intentions and more, well, a mix of bad intentions and just other factors that came together to bring about whatever the kinds of institutions we have and the nature of those institutions. And then I guess I would just say that I'm fine with Michael Malice calling me evil if he calls himself evil. And if he does not call himself evil, then I think that's a philosophical disagreement. That's a disagreement between his tuitions and my tuitions that I could talk about for 5 hours with him or with anyone. Because when I said I'm evil, or when I said everyone's evil, it wasn't even me saying my ideology is evil or my ideas about policy are evil. It was about bridging that gap between people we call evil and then what we would call normal people. And what I'm saying is there's less of a gap in a sense. And to be human means you have, good, you can do good and you can do evil, and everyone's a mix of both. And to not acknowledge that we're all a mix of both, I think, is dangerous. Which really, I guess, at the end of the day, is probably partly my skepticism of the red pill, in the sense that I think people who call themselves red-pilled are a bit too comfortable, or they're a bit too confident about their own righteousness and their own ability to see the truth. And I am less confident of my own righteousness, and I am less confident of my ability to see the truth. And so I do not say that I'm red-pilled. I attempt with all my might to come to understand the world as it is, but I guess I wouldn't necessarily call myself red-pilled in the same way that Michael Malice calls himself red-pilled.
So I'm gonna make two meta thoughts, two very meta thoughts, and a lot of times I'll save things for after the show and mention it. But I'm just gonna say a lot of meta thinking. One is I definitely, on the off chance that Michael Malice ever heard this and listened to this far in, I definitely did disservice to his nuanced way of saying it, because although he uses inflammatory language, he does bring a lot of nuance to it. So like he would probably say, well, a lot of the evil they're doing is subconscious for the reasons I outlined. But then he'd also point out people like Gavin Newsom doing lockdown orders that lock everybody in their house, but then he goes out to dinner. And he's like, what does this mean when you have a person who willfully makes rules to confine other people to their homes and then breaks them? And then he would say, there's clearly more overt malicious intent than we know that is not found out about. And he would probably stress that there's a lot more elites not caring and making other rules than I hearkened on. So he'd probably touch on a lot of things like that, and he'd probably cite a lot more examples than I could. I just don't necessarily, maybe I filtered out the things that he said that I don't feel as comfortable defending, or I don't have a strong philosophical opinions on. So this episode was definitely a filtered version of his ideology through my lens and what my big takeaways have been of being a fan of his. But I definitely have not done him justice. The other meta thought is, I think this is always a prevalent issue, so it's just worth acknowledging on air, that it's so easy when you have a conversation to conflate words, because of this is the issue with language. And it's not necessarily like wrong, but it's like if Michael Malice is saying you're evil for X, Y, and Z reason, and then you start saying like, well, we're all evil, and like, but there's degrees of evil and people are evil in different circumstances. It's almost like, yes, these are both philosophical points and they're both about evil, but it's also like, sometimes it's easy to, I just question, and this is also an intuition thing, because I hear that and I'm like, yeah, that's true, but I don't think that's relevant. And then I would be like, he would say something very specific. I'd be like, yeah, but you're evil for this reason because this is what evil is. And you could say that something else is evil, but that's not the point. And I think that's easy for us to do when we talk about philosophical things. That's just like the example of the last 5 minutes. But we probably do that a lot. Like we're trying to talk about education and institutions, and it's like, well, here's this institution. What's this institution doing? What is the neoliberal order? Well, in this facet they fall, and it is hard to keep track of. So no wonder, like if you tune into InfoWars, Alex Jones sounds so nutty because in some ways it probably makes sense to him. But if you're talking about anything abstract, you can get like 3 degrees away in like 10 minutes, and that's why our episodes probably go off the rails so much. Those are a couple meta things I just want to point out that I was observing as you gave your final thoughts.
Michael Malice, if you've gotten this far in this episode, which you obviously haven't, I urge you, come on this show and talk to us. I'm a broke college student. I can't give you money.
Yeah, I don't think he should talk to us because he would he has much more important things to do this time. He would think we're below him. We're like we would have to be very familiar with the body of his work and have something new to say, right? So I don't know how enthusiastic he'd be to do that, but I think he was a good springboard to at least try to analyze institutions that are regarded as legitimate in our society. I think he's one of the main people talking about that right now. So I think that was a worthwhile discussion. I think we got somewhere, even if it wasn't agreement, it was understanding, right? And even if it wasn't even through his definition, it was like something that was still of value to us. So hopefully it was of value to the listeners because you just listened to us argue for about a little over an hour. And I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation like our other ones. If you didn't hear last week's where we tried talking about this, but then ended up talking about how I think it's okay if anything bad happens to Tom Wolfe, I reiterate, if something bad happened to Tom Wolfe, I'd be okay with it. That would end the tyranny in Pennsylvania. So, So I endorse anything that happens to him, although I will not be doing that because I will be lawfully staying at my home and will not be leaving my home. So I would not do anything against his orders. But if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out our backlog, check out that last episode we did, and check out any of the times we've argued about a plethora of issues. And we generally try to dive deeper into things as opposed to the media institutions we criticize today. So we like to think we're a little above, what's his name? Well, what's the Cuomo that's on CNN? I like to think we do better than Chris Cuomo. I like to think we do a little bit better than Don Lemon. And I think we try to at least have substance, even though we don't have PhD credentials and we haven't written 4 or 5 books on these issues. And feel free to subscribe, catch us on any podcatcher or on YouTube, or just by searching Beyond Talking Points, you should be able to find more from us. So on that note, signing off, Matt.